I'm Bob Schwartz, co-founder of the Pathways to Prosperity Network, currently also serving as a senior advisor to the Harvard Project on Workforce. I was one of the 3 co-authors of the Pathways to Prosperity report that was alluded to earlier, released in early 2011. My other 2 colleagues in the report were Ron Ferguson, an economist from Harvard's Kennedy School, and a visiting journalist who happened to be in Cambridge at the time named Bill Simons, who had covered education for Business Week for many years. And when the 3 of us got together and first started talking in late 2008, basically the question that we were asking ourselves is, might it be timely to produce a report that would revive interest in school to work and career and technical education more generally, both of which had kind of receded from public view after at the end of the 90s, in particular school to work, which had been federally supported with a piece of legislation that was deliberately designed to sunset after 5 years. So in any event, without going through a lot of detail, we put out this report in 2011, released it at an event in Washington, got the then Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, to join us, which meant the press that followed Arne kind of came along. And as you can see, the language of this report from this little clip tells you that this was not a typical academic report. The fact that the report got a lot of attention, I think, had a lot to do with the fact that it was written primarily by a journalist, not by a couple of academics, even though I would say that neither Ron Ferguson nor I think of ourselves as sort of traditional academics. But in any event, the report got a lot of take-up, and over the next 6 months after we released the report, we had about 50 speaking invitations from 30 states and 5 countries. What I'm going to do is kind of walk you through some of the data that we used in the report, and again, I'll also introduce some data that was not available at the time, but basically, we were trying to make a pretty simple argument. We did no new research for this report. We simply brought together some existing data sets and tried to make an argument. And one of the pieces of data that was critical for us was, it was interesting, this was even around 2010, we were seeing employment projections for 10 years out, obviously, 2020. I've kept these original ones because they did help to guide us. And essentially, by the way, we relied this came from the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, a research center that I've found extremely useful over the years. We've relied a lot on its research and findings. It's led by a labor economist, Tony Carnevale, whose work I've known for many years. And basically, what this slide tells you is that if you roll the tape back to 1979, the U.S. economy at that point, only about 1/3 of jobs required a post-secondary education, 2/3 of jobs required a high school education, or less. And obviously, what this slide tells you is we were moving into a world in which the reverse was going to be true. At least 2/3 of the jobs would require post-secondary education. But what we kind of zeroed in on is that almost half of those jobs requiring post-secondary education would not necessarily require a 4-year degree. And so that was one number that kind of stuck in our heads. And that was important because a lot of other economists at that point were telling us that we were moving into a world in which there really were only going to be 2 kinds of jobs. High-skill, high-wage jobs requiring at least a 4-year degree, and then everybody else was going to be consigned to kind of to low-wage, low-skill work. We, I think, fortunately didn't buy that. It was while we understood that a lot of the traditional so-called middle skill or middle wage jobs in manufacturing in particular were rapidly declining and diminishing. With the growth of the service sector came a whole new set of these kind of middle skill jobs. And we'll talk much more about that as we get further into the presentation. The next slide, we kind of looked through the other end of the telescope and asked about educational attainment. Okay, if 2/3 of the jobs in the world we were moving into would require some post-secondary education, how are we doing on that dimension? And essentially what this slide tells you is if you add up those with graduate degrees, bachelor's degrees, again, as their highest degree, those with graduate degree is the highest degree, bachelor degree is the highest degree, and associate degree is the highest degree, you can see you get to about 40%. And when we talk about the gap here between what the labor market seemed to be requiring and what educational attainment was producing, that's where this kind of 25% figure comes in. Now you'll notice two other things, that there is the Lumina Foundation, which has really been tracking a lot of this attainment work, and is the foundation that has really helped states particularly raise the bar in terms of setting targets for 60% of people, young people, with graduate degrees, with post-secondary degrees. Initially, their target date was 2025, but their assumption is that although there's a ton of post-secondary certificates, their view was that only about 5% of those certificates held real value in the labor market. The other thing that's striking about this, and I've never seen another country that reports some college in its statistics about attainment, but we clearly have a lot of people who have some post-secondary education, but it's just simply not clear until you are able to unpack that what value, if any, that some college has in the labor market. So moving on, if we look quickly at high school graduation rates here, which the good news is that high school graduation rates have been slowly rising. We're now at about 85%, which is the highest they've ever been in the U.S. And the other piece of good news is that even though there still exists considerable gaps between white and Asian high school completion rates on the one side and Black and Latinx graduation rates on the other, those disparities have been consistently narrowing. So that is a piece of good news. Obviously, we'd like to see those disparities entirely closed, but we're not there. We're not there yet. What I think gets less attention, and yet for our story is in some ways even more important, and that has to do with the college completion rates, which really are extraordinarily low. You can look at these numbers, and these are 6 years. These are for students, full-time students, 6 years later, 2-year institutions and 4-year institutions, and these take into account transfer rates as well. And as you can see, we've got a huge way to go here when you look at those numbers. There's also, we have a continuing problem beyond those, who are enroll and drop out from higher education. We still have this huge army of disconnected young people between the ages of 16 and 24 who are neither in school nor at work. And obviously, those are the young people who are most at risk in this economy. If you don't have some kind of education credential and you don't have a work resume, you're consigned to the back of the hiring queue, and maybe in a full employment economy, you'll get some opportunities, but until then, it's pretty stark. This particular slide is the one I really want to dwell on, because I think it for one thing, it's susceptible to misinterpretation, but I think it tells a really important story, and one that we don't typically see. In this slide, we're using family wealth rather than income as the main criterion. We are dividing U.S. households into three groups: the high wealth families, the top 20% by family wealth, the middle 40%, and the bottom 40%. We are then looking at all people born in the 1970s and all people born in the 1980s. So we've got a kind of 20-year view. The dotted line represents some post-secondary experience, which really means that's an enrollment number. And as you can see, at least on the left-hand side, for the middle and low wealth group, those percentages of some attendance in college have been pretty steadily going up. And even from the low wealth group, we're now at about 50%. But if you ask the harder question, which is by age 25, what proportion of each group have actually attained a 4-year degree? Again, as you can see, that high wealth group, which is a matter of public policy we're not going to worry much about. But 60% of those young people by 25 have attained a 4-year degree. The middle wealth group, there's been slow but steady progress over this kind of 2-decade period. And now it's about 1 in 3, and that's the national average. That for 25-year-olds, it's about 33, 34% are the numbers that we typically use. It's the bottom 40% that's really striking here. And as you can see, 11.3% for those born in the 1970s, only a half a percentage point higher for those born in the 1980s. Now, obviously, if you believe, as I do, as John Simpkins said, in the earlier session, that human potential is roughly, equally distributed across these groups, this has nothing to do with the qualities of the young people themselves. This is really a reflection of the kind of the conditions under which kids born into low wealth families are living. And, we could spend a lot of time, as I say, kind of unpacking the causes. They typically have come from weaker high schools, either in inner cities or in rural America. Nobody perhaps has told them when they show up on the doorstep of college that they actually have to take some placement tests. If you haven't taken math for a couple of years and you haven't brushed up, all too typically you get consigned to remediation or developmental education. You start drawing down your Pell Grants, but you're not getting college credit. You're probably working 20 hours a week at least, and some people in this are trying to balance, full-time work and college. So it's very easy to see how one can begin kind of falling behind. And then the important point here is we now realize that the metric we now use for 4-year degrees is 6 years. We say we track the attainment rate after 6 years from initial enrollment. And the question is how likely is it that over a 6-year period, kids from families whose savings account may be $400 or less, how likely is it that some kind of event, car breakdown in childcare arrangements, a medical emergency in the family, all it takes is one event like that, and you might stop out in order to help the family and to go to work full-time if you haven't been working full-time. And then once you've stopped out, it becomes harder to come back. So that's for me, the big take home from this that I want us to really think about is if we are waiting around for our 4-year colleges and universities to really solve this problem of stalled economic mobility and weak economic opportunity for kids in low wealth families, it's going to be a very, very long wait, which is one of the reasons that we in our network have tended to really focus heavily on community and technical colleges. They have their own problems. I will be quick to say. One of the contributing factors, I think, to this outcome data is that, while 80% of young people who show up on the doorstep of a community college full-time say they're there in order to get their first, degree to move on, their big goal is to get a 4-year degree, less than 15% actually succeed in doing that within 6 years. 42% of the 2-year degrees are in liberal arts and general studies. I'm a big fan of liberal arts. I was a product of a liberal arts education, but a 2-year liberal arts or general studies degree, particularly if you're brown or black, has very little value in the labor market, at least in competitive labor markets. So ultimately, we've got a problem here. If I go back to the earlier slide about attainment, and you remember that only 10% of young people by 25 have as their highest degree a 2-year degree, that's a number that we simply have to dramatically increase, and we have to dramatically increase the young people who are getting 2-year degrees that have real value in the labor market, that combine academic and technical or career education in fields where there's high growth and high opportunity. This is an important slide. I mean, this tells you simply that the economic returns to degrees really do depend a lot on what the skills are that go along with those degrees and how well those skills match the demands of your regional labor market. And as you can see, we now are seeing a lot of overlap between bachelor's degrees and 2-year degrees, but especially if the 2-year degrees are in STEM fields. When we talk about STEM, it's important to realize that although we sometimes think, oh, STEM fields, those are fields that, 4-year degrees are better. Well, roughly half the jobs that have a STEM foundation to them are jobs that do not require a 4-year degree. And this is a huge chunk of the U.S. economy, and it's a growing chunk of the U.S. economy. As it happens, when we started to work, and I'm really now jumping into kind of Charlotte's, part of the presentation, but when we got out into the field and started to work with our initial states and regions, we didn't come with any sort of preconception about what fields, what industry sectors, what pathways would be the most important to begin. But we simply said to people, among other things, look around, talk to your employers, find employers who really are feeling the heat when it comes to their future workforce, who are highly motivated and want to come to the table with educators to help address their talent pipeline problems. And as it's turned out, across the places that we work, the healthcare sector, obviously a huge sector. Tech, which is not only a sector in itself, but obviously IT underpins lots of other sectors. Advanced manufacturing and engineering, even though that's a shrinking proportion of the economy, there are very, very good jobs in that sector. Business and financial services, some parts of the country, it really depends, but logistics, cybersecurity, these are the kinds of sectors. And if you ask, what do they have in common? Almost all of them have a strong STEM foundation. What are some examples of the kind of what we think of as middle skill STEM jobs? And here are 4 examples of jobs in these different sectors. Number of openings back, now 5 years ago, and median annual pay. This slide to me is a really interesting one because in some states, including Colorado, we now have data systems where researchers are able to connect education records and wage records. And what this tells you, what's interesting about this slide is this is able to follow young people not only a year after graduation, but 5 years later and 10 years later, and ask how are they doing in the labor market? What are their median earnings? And as you can see from the 2 lines that are bracketed in red at the bottom of the slide, those with 2-year degrees in applied science, that is AAS degrees, in Colorado at least, even 10 years later, are keeping pace with the average degree holder. Now, again, some of the international research tells us that those with technical or career degrees and apprenticeships, for example, that they may start out doing better, but over time, those with 4-year degrees will catch up. And again, I think, I don't mean that, I think in the long run, obviously, the more education you get, the better. But what these last couple of slides also suggest is, while that's true as a generality, the more important question in a sense is how well does your education and the skills you acquired match the needs of your regional economies? Just the last couple of slides before turning this over to Charlotte, who can talk about the network that sprang up and how it works, is that, in a sense, a summary of what this data tells us is, we have far too young people who are completing post-secondary degrees and credentials relative to the demand of the labor market. We also have continuing evidence that, not only do we have, yes, the high school dropout rate has been reducing, but we have a lot of evidence that an awful lot of kids are really bored in high school and they're there with their bodies, but their mind is, has left. On the other side of the equation, we know that jobs with a strong STEM foundation, even if not requiring 4-year degrees, hold a lot of promise. And a lot of the skill gaps we read about are in these so-called middle skill jobs with a strong technical foundation. And that careers increasingly require some combination of post-secondary education and work readiness skills and experiences. In any event, because of the quite extraordinary interest that our report generated, later that year, I approached colleagues at work at Jobs for the Future, including my wife, who'd been there at that point for something like 10 years and had been running the big early college high school initiative that the Gates Foundation had funded, and proposed the idea of our partnering together, the Graduate School of Education and JFF, because JFF just had a lot of experience in running cross-state initiatives like this. We sent letters out initially only to people we had good working relationships with in 8 states and said, here's what we're trying to do. If you're interested, send us a letter of interest. We laid out a set of questions that we asked people to answer. And we said, and oh, by the way, unlike most initiatives, not only are we not bringing you money, the Gates Foundation or other foundations have not given us a big bag of money, but we view this as a collaboration, and you're going to have to kind of ante up. And this is really, there's a kind of contract here. There'll be annual fees that we will ask of you for membership, but in return, you'll get kind of customized technical assistance and support from our team. And more important, we will bring you together with other members of the network as the network grows twice a year for in-depth learning experiences. And as Kyle said at the outset, I think this is our 19th such institute, and this is the first day in those 19 years that we've actually opened this up to folks who are not part of the network. But I think as you talk to folks in the network, what she'll tell you is that this has been a real source of value because this has promoted kind of cross-regional learning. And a lot of the work of the network has really been built around this community of practice and the sharing of learning as we've moved along. I'll just say a final word before turning this over to Charlotte. What this slide indicates is those states that are in dark green are currently members of the network. The states in the lightly shaded green were members of the network. We asked people to make 3-year commitments because we thought that was the kind of minimum period to really get started on the system building work. But Tennessee, for example, was one of our first 5 states that has remained a very active member. So states have, some dropped out before 3 years, but several have stayed on now over many years. The circles indicate states where we have our Pathways team does additional work, typically on contract that's related to the state or region's membership in our network, but goes beyond the terms of the initial kind of membership agreement. So with that, Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks, Bob, and apologies to you all for my previous technical difficulties, but I think I've got myself straightened out now. So picking up where Bob left off, I think, as we do this work across the country, we, are very cognizant, as I was mentioning in the opening session, of varied contexts in which this work is happening. And we hear a set of questions from across stakeholder groups that are pretty common, from employers asking sort of, why can't I find candidates with the skills I need? Or educators really trying to figure out how to prepare students for careers, sort of looking beyond what happens at the end of high school or at the end of college. From economic developers, we often, hear, how can we grow our economies? How can we attract more employers? And from students themselves, we often hear questions about, wanting to better understand whether they need a degree and really what their career options are. So as we do this work, we have those questions front and center in our minds. And I know many of you just heard me talk about this slide. I will warn you that there's some duplicates in here for those of you who were in the opening session. And I have a little bit more time now than I did then to say a little bit more about these. But we really focus on achieving outcomes at 4 levels, preparing students for success in K-12, in post-secondary, in their careers and communities. We focus on building skilled talent pipelines for employers, knowing that that has real benefits for communities and economies. So we seek also to build more vibrant communities that are full of really connected and engaged citizens, and to build state and regional economies that are growing and thriving across all of those key industry sectors Bob was mentioning. As we think about this work of redesigning systems to better serve all young people, we really, we don't have a clear model, but we do have some stakes in the ground around what we think it takes to do this work well. So we believe that all young people should be completing high school with at least 12 college credits. I can say more about sort of why 12 college credits in a minute, but 12 college credits, some work-based learning experience. We hope that they will attain post-secondary credentials with value in the labor market, launch careers in high demand, high wage, and high growth occupations, and critically always leave open the opportunity to pursue further education and career advancement as they are interested. So I found out yesterday that almost everybody on our team has included this slide in their presentation in this round of sessions. So we really like it. And what this cartoon, right, is really demonstrating is something that we've seen go on for a long time, which is everybody sort of suggesting that it is someone else's job to figure out how to solve all of these challenges that Bob has outlined. And really what the Pathways work is about is figuring out how we can make it everyone's job to solve this collectively. So working across all of these key stakeholder groups and always remembering that for this work to be sustainable over the long term, we need to make sure that there's a clear value proposition for each partner engaged in the work. We don't want people to come to this work just out of the goodness of their hearts, but to build really sustainable partnerships in which all of those partners are seeing value in the work for their particular organizations and missions. As I mentioned, we have these 5 key strategies that we look to for Pathways implementation, and wanted to say just a little bit more about what we think each of these looks like. So thinking about building out college and career pathways that are aligning secondary and post-secondary education, it's really about braiding together both rigorous core academics and career-focused learning across the secondary and post-secondary education continuum with multiple on and off ramps along the pathway so that students are not sort of locked into a particular choice. We think about permeability in pathways. We think about the need for flexibility in pathways, and want to ensure that students are still on a pathway to successful education and career outcomes. So part of the way that we do that is by designing pathways that are sort of reverse mapped from regional labor markets. So we look to first understand what are the careers that are in demand in a particular region and also pay family supporting wages. Not good enough to be in demand, but also we really look to see where are the good jobs. And then we look to post-secondary education programs and try to better understand whether those are aligned with the demand in the regional labor market. And then from there, look to better understand how K-12 education is preparing students to enter and succeed in those post-secondary programs. As we think about career information and advising, we know that most young people are not getting a lot of advice about the pathways that are available to them and about career possibilities, much less about kind of the role of meaningful and productive life in human lives. And we task, right, teachers and parents and counselors with providing a lot of this information, but often don't provide the support those people need to understand the future labor market or to fully understand all of the high growth industries that are out there. Closely connected to this question of career information and advising is work-based learning as a really critical lever for our pathways work, and I think a key component of our, efforts to build equitable pathways systems. So as we think about work-based learning, many of you may have seen a work-based learning continuum before. JFF does not exactly have a continuum. We have a framework with a lot of arrows that go every which way. And the reason for all of those arrows that go every which way is that we're really conscious of that question of permeability and flexibility. And, think of work-based learning as a set of really sequenced and intentional opportunities, and want to ensure that we're not thinking of it just as a checklist. So students attend a career fair in 9th grade and then do job shadowing in 10th grade and an internship after the summer of their junior year of high school. But instead, right, that the work-based learning activities are built out in a way that provides opportunities for young people to explore a variety of careers as interested. And at the same time, to start really through these different levels of work-based learning experience, from career exploration to exposure to engagement to then career experience at the most intensive, and really having the opportunity to progressively gain knowledge and skills that are relevant to careers. To make all of this happen, we badly need to build out intermediary organizations that can both help to convene stakeholders within a pathway system and really help to set some of the vision and voice for pathways work. And we need intermediaries that can broker and aggregate work-based learning opportunities and help, bridge kind of the education system and industry on the other side. We know that educators and employers often do have common goals, but don't have speak quite the same languages, or maybe they're not operating on quite the same timeline. We also see this function of brokering work-based learning opportunities as really critical to ensure that all students have equitable access to work-based learning opportunities. So something that we see often, for example, is the largest school district in a given region will sort of build out employer relationships, and then smaller districts may have more trouble getting in and building similar relationships. And on the employer side, right, this greatly simplifies and streamlines kind of the pipeline of students coming in to do work-based learning. So we continue, we know, to have really significant challenges that we need to address in this work, including these deepening and widening inequities that we've seen, largely along lines of race and class. We know that Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth and those who are experiencing poverty are becoming disproportionately disconnected from our education and workforce systems. Over this last year of the pandemic, we've seen declining enrollment rates in post-secondary education. It's been a tough year, and career-connected learning and career information aren't necessarily really prioritized. And the recession associated with the pandemic has also had big implications, both for kind of employment and the availability of jobs, but also for our ability to really get a solid handle on what the labor market looks like now, much less what the labor market will look like in the future. That said, we really rely, as Bob said, on a collaboration with pathways leaders across the country to figure out some of the answers to these questions. So we come together as a network because we see opportunities for shared learning, for coordinated engagement, for ways of achieving economies of scale in this work, for sharing data and metrics, and building a coalition of advocates for the kinds of policy changes we need in order to make this work succeed. So, as Bob was saying, we work with state and regional leaders across the country to support their pathways efforts and really seek to understand kind of what is needed in particular contexts, and then to dig in to provide tailored supports, which, so very often we do work like supporting strategic planning or policy development and analysis. We do asset mapping to help folks better understand kind of the conditions for pathways development and how to align and leverage existing systems. And we support regional pathways design and sustainability planning. If, as we run out of time in this session, you want to learn more, Bob and Nancy Hoffman, from whom you heard in the opening session, are editing a series of books on work and learning that's being put out by the Harvard Education Press. So we certainly encourage you to dig in and learn more if you want. Someday we will all be in person at an institute again, and perhaps Bob would even agree to sign copies of these books. So with that, I know we only have a few minutes left, but really want to turn it over all to you all for your questions. You're welcome to use the chat in order to ask your questions. And if you want to come on camera and ask a question that way, you can, but it's a little bit tricky. What you'll need to do is go up to the top left corner of your screen and hit the video and audio icons that you see up there. And then once you have done that, I will make you live in Bizzabo platform parlance so that we can all hear you.
Cheryl, we had one good question in the chat about basically Erin is asking, she says she's curious about the digital divide and how it contributes to the challenges completing post-secondary or finding success in the workforce. Are there any digital skill frameworks that are used by education and employers? I turn that one to you.
So on the specific question about digital skill frameworks, I think the answer is yes and. So yes, there are digital skills frameworks. Is there one around which there is consensus? Not so much. So I've seen a number of different examples. I think one of the challenges that we've really seen is coming to a consensus on what some of those most critical skills are. I do think, as we think about the digital divide, certainly access to broadband and devices has been really sort of a challenge for a lot of people and has absolutely affected engagement in education at both the secondary and post-secondary levels. Or I should, not so much but as and we see possibilities in some of the new kind of, virtual settings and growing digital fluency in really being able to scale some of this work in ways that were not previously possible. Bob, what would you add?
I would add a plug for an initiative at the Harvard Project on Workforce, my home base these days. When the pandemic hit, it was really interesting. We had a fabulous group of graduate students across business school and the ed school and the Kennedy School who came together and decided to build a learning platform focused particularly on displaced workers in our region who we knew had little, if any, prior experience learning online. And what they did is they went out and curated the best available materials from all kinds of sources. But the interesting thing was we decided only to focus on 3 areas, one of which, and the most important in a sense, was digital literacy. And this initiative is called Skill Base. If you Google Harvard Project on Workforce and you go to our site, the first thing that pops up is Skill Base. It's been piloted across Massachusetts in our one-stop centers. It's aimed primarily at adults, but I think it has potential uses for younger people as well. So it's actually the three things we focused on were digital literacy. English is a second language because, at least in our region, a ton of second language learners, and we know that that's a barrier for particularly acquiring the new kinds of skills that will enable people to shift careers. And the third area was kind of employability skills, sort of writ broadly. I guess we are just about on time. If anybody has another question, happy to take it on.
I see one here. I see a couple here. One about effective strategies for building pathways in rural communities.
Yeah.
Which, Bob, do you want to tackle that one first, or?
But I'd simply say that that's been one of the things that's been most fascinating, I think, for Charlotte and me, as urban types, has been seeing how this work develops in rural communities where there are clear challenges. But Upper Cumberland in Tennessee is a place that we've spent a lot of time in. Charlotte's done work all over Texas, both in more urban and rural parts of the state. So that is one of the things that I think a lot of us have learned from this work, not only what the challenges are, but what the strategies are that do seem to make a difference. The only thing I'd say about that is what struck me is how highly motivated leaders are in a lot of these communities to find strategies for keeping their talented young people at home and trying to stem the flow of talent, from the rural communities to the cities. Entrepreneurship is obviously one strategy that a lot of places have employed, really trying to give young people the skills to start their own, micro industries, if you want to call them that. But Charlotte, your observations on that?
Yeah, no, so I agree with that. And I think one of the sort of things where we've really seen rural communities be successful is in getting those strong partnerships needed for this work off the ground. And the other piece of this is, and this is a little bit what I was thinking of when I said, we hope that there are some possibilities in this brave new virtual world. On the one hand, we know that broadband access is a huge issue in rural communities. Yeah. On the other, it can help alleviate some of the infrastructure problems we see in terms of like transportation, for example, in pathways work in rural communities, as well as the limited employer base that we see in some rural communities. So we've seen people really successfully start to think about pathway strategies in fields like cybersecurity, for example, in more rural areas.
As you move into the next sessions, where you'll have a chance to sample, what the work really looks like from some of the really talented leaders we work with. One observation that I'd make that we neglected to point out, which is that not only does the work really vary from region to region, but we have different lead organizations region to region. So if you go to Arizona, for example, you'll see the presenters are based at a nonprofit called the Center for the Future of Arizona. If you go to the New York site, you'll see that the two leaders, one comes from a nonprofit, the other from the Center for Youth Employment, which is a mayoral agency. When we're just thinking about rural Tennessee, it's the Rural Chamber of Commerce in Highland County in Upper Cumberland that has really driven the work. So a range of organizations kind of have stepped forward to take the lead in this work.